Welcome. In this video, we are going to discuss some supports for your lesson planning. First, let's talk a little bit about revisions. By this point, you might be ready to revise some of the work you've done. If you have revisions to make to any of your lesson plans, please put those revisions right in the document itself. This means the document that I return to you with your grade and initial comments on, please revise this document. This way you can leave my comments if possible. This allows me to stay focused as I reread your lesson plan on the questions that I've asked you and areas I've asked you to continue to think about. Another support is to put your revisions in a different color, please. Again, this helps me to stay focused on the areas of the lesson plan that you've done some rethinking around. Once you have made your revisions, please do one of two things. You may either upload that revision to the Dropbox and email me to let me know that it's in there, or you may just email it as an attachment to me. Either way, please alert me that you've done so that I can give you feedback as soon as possible. There is a time frame that you do need to submit revisions. For summer and Saturday courses, you must resubmit within 24 hours of me returning your initial grade to you. For weeknight courses, you need to do your revisions within 1 week of that initial feedback from me. If at any time you have questions about any of the feedback on your lesson plans, please email or call me. Just a reminder, you may only revise each piece of your work one time. Just a reminder about the purpose of writing lesson plans out. We definitely know that the template you are using for lesson planning may be different and may include more components than how you might typically plan. This exercise is really about building your muscle. It's about building your thinking around differentiating for language and all of the things that go into that. Finally, a piece of this is so that we can picture or see how you teach students language and content, since unfortunately we cannot observe each one of you. These are the areas we're going to explore with lesson planning today. We're going to look at the opening section of your lesson plan where background or prior knowledge is activated. We'll take a look at the body and discuss gradual release and the can-do descriptors. Then at the end, we'll go back and discuss the language portions and talk about how we can make sentence frames that help students transfer their language and learning. Just a friendly reminder to please make sure that you are using graduate level writing and grammar with any of your submissions or resubmissions. If you need support with this, you can contact the Regis Writing Center or your instructor, and we can point you in the direction of some resources that will help you. Let's take a look first at the background section. You'll find this in the opening part of your lesson plan. Remember, this part of the lesson is so that you can help students activate their prior knowledge or build some background knowledge about the key content and key language that they're learning in the lesson. You might think about this as the hook of the lesson. Just a reminder, this isn't a spot for you to list the background that they need to have or the pieces of background. This is a time in the lesson to actually describe what students are doing, and it's a place to start to engage them from the get-go. It should go beyond you telling them what they're learning or you telling them the language that they need. In this section, students should be practicing and engaging and thinking. Let's look at a few examples. Take a moment, and if you need, pause the screencast to read this example of the background section from a lesson plan. You'll notice here that the teacher helps students by using a social or personal experience to help them practice both the concept and the language before they apply it to something more academic. So the concept here is really about opinion. The teacher wants them to apply their opinion to a book. But before she gets into the meat of the lesson where they're working on that, she allows them to consider their opinions with everyday things they can relate to. She also allows them the opportunity to practice the language of opinion. Again, first with this personal experience of sun or rain, pizza and hamburgers. Then they will use the same language to give their opinion about the text they will read. Let's look at one more. Again, take a moment to read this. If you need to pause the screencast, please do so. In this example, the teacher is spending more time building prior knowledge than background knowledge. She's activating some key concepts that students have already explored, because today they're going to do that in a different context. You'll notice here again that she helps them think about the concept and the language that they will need to do this. So take some time now to look at the opening section of one of your lesson plans. You can choose the vocabulary lesson if you would like to revise that section, or you can begin to work on your oral language lesson. Thinking of some of the key pieces we just went over here. Did you engage your students in that opening section? Are they interacting with language and concepts? Have you gone beyond just telling them what they're going to learn and allowed them to interact with it in meaningful ways? How are you going to really get them hooked? Pause the screencast and take some time now to think through this piece. The next piece of lesson planning we want to think about is the gradual release of responsibility. This really comes into play in the body of your lesson, but in the least must be present as we look at your whole lesson plan, the opening, the body, and the closing. Somewhere during the course of your lesson, you need to have had I do, we do, and you do. Remember, the I do is when the teacher models content and language. Oftentimes, this is done through a think aloud. Remember, any lessons we do with English learners will need models of both content and language, and not just one or the other. We do is the next piece of gradual release. During this part, students begin to try out the functional language and the content that they've learned. This is more guided instruction. The final pieces of gradual release are you do it together and you do it independently. Really, this is releasing more responsibility to the students instead of having all of that responsibility on the teacher. An important thing to note with gradual release is that it does not necessarily follow a linear process. You don't necessarily have to do an I do before you do a you do. We know that with learning, we're constantly going between all of these pieces of support. And in the best classrooms, that's what we should be doing. We know that as we see feedback from students, that we might need to do another I do in the middle of our lesson if students need more modeling with content or language. We may even start out with a you do to see what our new students need and then work from there. Take a look at this example and pause the screencast. On your online reflection guide, there is a section for you to think about this example. On your reflection guide, please note the portions of this example that display I do, we do, and you do, paying close attention to how the teacher thinks through the language and the content for students. Now that you've thought through these important pieces of gradual release, go back to your lesson plan. You might focus on the body section, but really gradual release may be included in all sections. You may work with your vocabulary lesson to revise it, or you may get started with your oral language lesson. Think about including an I do, a we do, a you do, somewhere in the body of your entire lesson. Remember to gradually release both content and language. Pause the screencast now to do this thinking. Let's talk about the can-do descriptor section. Remember, the can-do descriptor section is in the body section of your lesson plan. You may want to go back to the Freedom Summer Lesson Plan exemplar to see an example of how the teacher used can-do descriptors to differentiate her plan for her students. Remember, the purpose of this section is not to rename the supports and everything you've already planned. It is also not a copy and paste of the can-do descriptor right from the WIDA resource. It is also not a place to list as many can-do descriptors as possible. Instead, what you want to think about in this part is taking 2 proficiency levels. I would recommend the 2 proficiency levels that address most of the students in your class, and figure out what those groups of students will need in addition to what is already planned in your lesson. So for example, you may say in your lesson that all students are going to use a graphic organizer to help them, let's say, compare and contrast something. In your can-do, you're not going to list that students are going to use a graphic organizer to compare and contrast. This is already in your lesson. But you might say, for my level 1 students, I'm going to actually give them pictures so that they can paste or label those pictures and put them into the graphic organizer, since at their level of language proficiency, they may not be able to write in sentences yet or fill out that graphic organizer like the other students in your class. Remember to make this section as specific as possible. The can-do descriptor may say something like label pictures. Instead of just saying label pictures or match pictures, think about the example I just gave. Instead, I would use that can-do descriptor, that idea of labeling or matching, and I would say students will label or match pictures in the graphic organizer that compare and contrast these 2 types of animals that I'm working on in my lesson plan. Take a moment now to revise or construct the can-do section of your lesson plan. Remember to keep these key ideas in the table in mind. Pause now. Finally, let's talk about making great sentence frames. Just a reminder, frames aren't really a fill-in-the-blank. The best frames consist of the basic functional language that can be used across topics and context. This is key. Remember to use the rubric and language touchstones to help you figure out the sentence frames at each language proficiency level. Let's look at this example. You may also want to pull out your online reflection guide right now and follow along. Let's look at the sentence frame at the top in white. In the book, Freedom Summer, John Henry feels blank because he cannot blank. Notice that this is not transferable across contexts or different books. The sentence frame is too specific. It's become a fill-in-the-blank. Good sentence frames are not fill-in-the-blanks. Notice the revision in blue. In the, and then in parentheses, textbook article, and then in the blank beside it, you could write any book or article. The character feels blank because. Notice in this example how I could lift this and use this with any other text, book, or article. It is open-ended enough to help students feel successful and transfer the language. Take a look now at your online reflection guide. Looking at the sentence frame and thinking about the construction, what language level do you believe this would be for? How do you know? Here's another example. The girl was blank. The teacher would say, why? Grandma made her. Again, this is a fill in the blank. Here's an example of a revision in blue that would make this more transportable. Take some time now again on your reflection guide to decide what language level this would be for, and how do you know? Here's another example. Pause, take a look to reflect. Notice how this is revised to be more open-ended and transportable, and then write on your reflection guide what level you think it's for. Here's our last example. It's your turn to practice turning this fill-in-the-blank to an actual sentence frame. Again, refer to your graphic organizer on your reflection guide. Take this sentence frame and turn it in to one that is really more of a sentence frame versus a fill-in-the-blank. Finally, take some time now to check your lesson. Under the language section near the top, are your frames fill-in-the-blank, or are they transportable to content areas? Do they fit your proficiency level? And then also, as you think about the rest of your lesson, have you introduced the sentence frames and vocabulary to your students?